All right, awesome. So I think it's safe to say we can get started. Hello, salam, welcome everyone to this event, Malcolm's Worldmaking Practice, Reclaiming His Local and Global Legacy. This event is hosted by both the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies at Columbia University in partnership with the Shabazz Center. And I'd love to first thank the panelists for so graciously offering their time and their knowledge and experience with us. And before jumping in for a moment, I'd love to frame this conversation. Maybe provide a little bit of history around the idea of the event, and in turn, end up providing a little bit of history about myself as well. So I am the moderator for this panel today. My name is Sumaiya Zama, as I have said. I am currently an MA student in the Islamic Studies program at Columbia University. I come from Boston. I'm a longtime community organizer from the Boston area. I'm a youth worker. And prior to coming to Columbia University, I organized around civil rights issues in the Muslim community in Boston. And so I promise this connects to sort of the history of the event. As I was transitioning to New York this summer to start this program, there were a lot of questions I had. As a new Columbia student, I had never attended Columbia before. As someone attending a PWI for the first time, as someone who is a Muslim woman, largely guided by the Islamic theology, the Islamic liberation theology that we will discuss later in this event, I had a lot of questions about my context and about who I was going to be in this space. I had questions about where I was supposed to live. I had questions about what my role was in the institutional and structural racism I had learned about and that I had seen in Boston myself and had combated in Boston myself. And so in the wake of that, in the wake of mutual aid work, protests in Boston, I got an email about an anti-racism mini grant provided by the university. I, again, had a lot of questions. Columbia is offering this anti-racism mini grant. If I were to win this, I would want to find a way to elevate the work of organizations and organizers in Harlem. And so, thankfully, we did secure this mini grant, and this event is sponsored by that mini grant. And so that is providing a little bit of context around the spirit of the event and this idea of really getting to the heart of issues and connecting a lot of dots between what we will begin to describe as Malcolm's world-making practice, this hybrid of his Islamic liberation theology, his anti-imperialism, his vehemently anti-capitalist beliefs. How are we employing that world-making practice as folks who are connected to powerful institutions? So that is a little bit about, I know that was a lot, and we will flesh out a lot of these ideas as the event goes on. But I do want to give the panelists each a couple minutes to introduce themselves and to also maybe speak a little bit about why this conversation is important to them in this current political moment. So I don't want to call on anyone. If anybody feels compelled to go first, or I can call on people.
I'll start, Sumaiya, since we worked together. You graciously invited me and the Shabazz Center into this process. Hi, everyone. My name is Najha, and I'm coming live from Central Harlem, 129th Street. I'm currently the Director of Institutional Advancement at the Shabazz Center at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. I'm a lifelong Harlemite. Sumaiya and I, we kind of switched roles. I just recently left Boston. I was at Harvard Divinity School studying Black social movement history, womanist ethics, theology, and also Black culture production. And before that, I got to be a student of the movement in North Carolina, where I think some of the most impressive, most radical organizing work around the movement for Black lives is happening. And so it's a really important time that we're living in, specifically with COVID, with a real increase in clarity around the movement for Black lives and what we need to do in order to win and build power. And so to be at the Shabazz Center in this moment of re-energizing our organization, expanding our work and reach, and also recommitting ourselves to a certain ideology rooted in Malcolm's vision for political power, sovereignty, and also a real sense of a spiritual clarity is important. And so I'm just excited to be in conversation with y'all as we expand Malcolm's legacy, because especially for young folks, I'm part of the millennial generation. You know, it's interesting, we're not really taught Malcolm. And even at Harvard in the Black Studies department, there were so few classes on Malcolm's work. And I think that's not a coincidence. That's not by accident. And it's really important that we do the work of excavating Malcolm, particularly the last year and a half of his life, and thinking about the ways in which we can employ that work alongside the vision of abolition, alongside the work of grassroots organizers, educators committed to the streets, not the institutions they're a part of, and reframe also the dynamics of power that have really, I think, stymied our growth in Harlem and the growth of Black-led institutions in my community. And so I'm just grateful to be here and to dig deep and to tell the truth.
Thank you so much, Najha.
Sumaiya, just calling us.
We're both very nervous. I'll go. I think that first of all, thank you for Sumaiya for organizing this. I'm so excited and so proud to be a part of this panel. For me, Malcolm X looms so large personally. I cannot imagine a life as an activist or as a scholar or as a believer without the presence of Malcolm X. I read his autobiography many years ago, and as a teen, and I haven't been the same since. And because of that, I feel like I owe so much to Malcolm and his legacy and his work. And I think that we don't do a sufficient job of, you know, as Najha said, we don't do a sufficient job of taking Malcolm up as a serious intellectual within these spaces. We don't do a sufficient job of unpacking, excavating, to use her language, Malcolm's work, Malcolm's ideas, and Malcolm's growth, both post Nation of Islam, post March of '64, but also his own political formation as a child, his own political formation as a child of Garveyites, his own understanding of the world as an incarcerated, prison intellectual from 48, when he was incarcerated, from 46 to 52, and then really complicating the story of Malcolm beyond the movie-fied, Disney-fied kind of narrative that really doesn't do justice to Malcolm's radical praxis or his political sophistication and complexity. So I'm honored to talk about that today and really get down with y'all about this as much as we can.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Hisham Aidi. I teach at Columbia. I'm trained as a political scientist, but I'm an unconventional one. I look at political questions, social movements, democracy, race, empire, but through music and art. And to me, Malcolm is a work of art. The autobiography is a work of art, obviously, but also Malcolm himself. I assign, when I talk about decolonization, I assign Haile Selassie's speech at the League of Nations, where he's talking about the hypocrisy of the West, but I also assign a number of pieces by Malcolm, right? So these days we talk about decolonization and decolonizing and decoloniality, and Malcolm was critical to the Bandung movement. He was traveling overseas in 1958 at the height of Bandung, and the Bandung movement would inspire him. Much of his organizing in Harlem, connecting the urban peripheries, the ghettos, the barrios, the favelas, to decolonization. And I can't think of another figure in modern history who has inspired so many movements and counter movements and so much geopolitical maneuvering to contain him in the 60s, but also today. So my interest is Malcolm X's global footprint, the movements he inspires around the world, but also his role as a bridge or as a connector for the wretched of the earth around the world, right? For the people in urban peripheries, ghettos, and I often say that Malcolm X is a geopolitical bellwether. Once a community when a community gains interest in Malcolm X, it means that this urban beleaguered community is beginning to develop a race consciousness, right? He's a political thermostat of sorts. And I'm particularly interested in, I'm sorry, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, thank you.
No, I don't think anyone said anything.
Oh, okay, I heard it cut. And I was gonna say, and I'm particularly interested in the role of Malcolm X in art and music and how his message travels around the world through art and music. And how nowadays, as Najha hinted at, Malcolm is much bigger overseas than he is here, right? That's something to discuss, right?
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Hisham. Before we jump into questions, I would be remiss not to elevate Najha. And maybe this is something I missed in the framing of my conversation. While Najha is here in the capacity of a panelist, Najha is my terrific, amazing, awesome co-organizer for this event and has been sort of by my side, pulling a lot of different strings and pulling everything together essentially. And so, she's amazing, and I'm so excited for Najha, you to sort of flesh out also every single thing that you want to put forward about the Shabazz Center and about Harlem. And so I just want to be clear in that, very, very clear. And so, the first question that we definitely wanted to sort of start to explore is this idea that most people know Malcolm as a minister with the Nation of Islam and as a Black nationalist leader in the United States. Fewer knew Malcolm or know Malcolm as a global visionary who learned from and built with leaders across the world. How can we use Malcolm's global vision for self-determination and building power as a way to frame global anti-imperial struggles? Wondering if Marc, you would be willing to take a stab at that first.
Yeah, sure. It's a wonderful question. And I think you're right. There's a way that we reduce Malcolm's breadth to the work he did in the nation. And there's a way that we don't understand Malcolm as global figure, not just as someone who traveled in the late 50s and again in 1964, March of 64, but someone who had a global vision. But I think it's also important, though, to not disconnect Malcolm's Nation of Islam training and experience, which was the bulk of his time, both as Muslim and as public figure, right? I mean, Malcolm is only out of the nation from March of 64 until February of 65. So we also want to keep track of that as well. So I think we have to look at Malcolm's formation before he even begins traveling. First of all, he is the child of Garveyites. And so as a UNIA baby, Malcolm was from day one thinking really deeply, or taught to think really deeply about being a global citizen, about internationalism, about the significance of Africa, and about understanding the interconnectedness of struggles around the globe. So that's the first thing. Malcolm joins the Nation of Islam, in prison. Somewhere around 51, 52, Malcolm stands up, he writes his letter to Elijah Muhammad, and he becomes a member of the Nation of Islam, which itself was looking globally in certain ways. The idea of the Muslim within the Nation of Islam theology and theodicy to a large extent, was rooted in a belief that that the original man, right, the Asiatic Black man, the maker, the owner, the cream of the planet Earth, the father of civilization, the God of the universe, was a person who was part of a Muslim or an ummah, right? They were part of a global community of Muslims, and that we were only a minority in the context of the United States. But that when we talked about the identity of what it meant to be Black, that was for him inclusive of Arabs. For the Nation of Islam, that was inclusive of Arabs. That was inclusive. So there's an Afro-Arab dynamic and Afro-Arab solidarity rooted in Nation of Islam beliefs. All of this is bound up in an understanding of what was possible for freedom, right? That our freedom was inextricably tied to us understanding ourselves as global, as part of a global community, as part of a global ummah, and that Muslim or the Islamic sort of the Muslim identity was part and parcel of who Malcolm was, and to Muslims it's part of the basis of there's an argument. There's the idea is, again, we're all Muslim at heart and by nature, and that you can revert to Islam. Mm-hmm. But so when Malcolm was talking about the Muslim community, it wasn't just about those who had taken Shahada. It was also about it was a broader understanding of what was possible for a global community of oppressed people. Mm-hmm. So then finally, when you get to this third moment that people are often, most excited to talk about when they talk about Malcolm and on this issue, it's like, oh yeah, Malcolm was connected to these global leaders. Malcolm traveled. Malcolm was received as a head of state in many ways when Malcolm is in international travel. When Malcolm is in Egypt, when Malcolm is in Ghana, when Malcolm is in Palestine, Malcolm is being received in a very particular way. And I don't want to. I'll move quickly. I want to pass the mic, but I mean, Malcolm was deeply influenced by the Bandung Conference. Malcolm was profoundly impacted by the non-allied movement, right? Malcolm was profoundly impacted by the victories that he saw in 54 and 56. Think about the Gamal Abdel Nasser's defeat of the tripartite aggression of France, Israel, and the UK. Malcolm was profoundly impacted by Kwame Nkrumah. Malcolm had relationships with those people, but beyond that, Malcolm understood the possible anti-colonial struggle and anti-colonial victory because he had been trained that way, he had been taught that way, and now as he traveled the world, he was able to understand that in a radical movement. So in the last sentence I would say is, it's so important for us to not think about Malcolm's last days as a moment where he became a colorblind sort of multicultural action figure, right? But that instead it became a moment where he understood, or he developed a belief that there was, to quote Adam Getachew, that there's a possibility of world making after empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Marc. And I think it's especially important that, we don't cherry pick what we want, and we don't reduce Malcolm to the space in his life that is most convenient for us in our current context, in our current identity, in our current moment, and being mindful that he was a full person. So thank you so much for that beautiful reminder. Najha, I'm wondering if you like to jump in on this question as well.
Yeah, there's so much to say. It's really important that we remember that Malcolm grew up in a Garveyite household with a mother who was of Caribbean descent. And so he was born into an internationalist framework. And I'm thinking a lot about what it meant for his parents to be landowning Black folks in the 20s and in the 30s, when that wasn't happening. And there's something really important about that, because like within the context of the United States and our own conception of what it means to be a citizen and what it means to be in possession of our full humanity, owning land is central to that. And as we know, for a very long time, only white land-owning men were considered human and were considered citizens of the US imperial project. And so for Malcolm's parents to push against that, and really ultimately that led to the downfall of his family and to their death, that I think that firmly rooted Malcolm in a politic of Black sovereignty and Black land ownership. And it also, I think, is connected to Malcolm's conception of humanity, which it really like is actively pushing against conceptions of white supremacist conceptions of what it means to be in possession of ourselves and possession of the land that we own. And so I think that's one important context in which we can really begin to understand Malcolm, not just because I think, and it's funny, everyone was getting mad at Jacobin magazine yesterday because they were like, in 64 and after Malcolm, went across the world and became an internationalist, and folks were like, no, he grew up in an internationalist home, and that's so true. But what is important to note about the last year and a half of Malcolm's short but prolific life is his connection, and Marc, you spoke about this to a connection and really like his desire to learn and build from anti-colonial leaders on the continent, inter-ethnic coalition building. And Malcolm saw what was happening, saw the real push against European imperialism, European colonialism, and said, we need to take this ideological framework, this political strategy, and employ it in our own communities. And so Malcolm actively took the framework and the real thought and the genius behind the Organization for African Unity and brought that back to Harlem and brought that to the Organization and created the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And so, he's building all of these connections between what's happening on the continent during the 60s and connecting that to the plight of Black folks in the United States. And Malcolm says, and sometimes this gets kind of watered down, I think, this idea that Malcolm's like, we need to think beyond civil rights. Well, this is a human rights issue. And sometimes people usurp that and are like, Malcolm wasn't that radical. But it's like, no, really what Malcolm was talking about is what does it mean to be in possession of our full humanity? And then we can begin to rethink about Malcolm's early years when his parents were a part of his life and alive, and what he was learning from his parents who were Black landowners in a time when, you were killed for owning land. And so I think that this kind of like conception of sovereignty and land ownership as a young person connected to Malcolm's understanding of liberation and sovereignty across the diaspora really helped to animate his understanding of global movements, both on the continent and the Middle East, but then also here in the United States and here in Harlem.
So beautiful and so well said. Especially just, this idea that like, what do we mean when we talk about sovereignty? And if we're not talking about our own bodies, what are we talking about? Thank you so much. Professor Hisham, I'm wondering if you want
to. I'll just say something about the internationalism. Yes, he grew up in an internationalist household. His mother, originally from Grenada, spoke French. She tried to teach him French. If you look at the Schomburg has Malcolm's book collection. One of my favorite pieces there is a book by Jean-Paul Sartre called Black Orpheus. And it's meticulously marked up. He's even correcting the translation from French to English, right? In fact, the French often said that by any means necessary, that Malcolm actually got that from Jean-Paul Sartre. I don't think they'd be saying that today, given their fear of all things Islamic. But so yeah, he had that internationalist background, and then in the nation, he gets a new sort of the discipline, but a new internationalist vision that links different parts of the colonized world, the Afro-Asiatic world, the Nile Valley, Nubian civilization becomes an anchor. Realize it was in prison where he wrote a letter to the Egyptian embassy asking for halal food, mid-50s, right? And then he goes overseas as an emissary of the nation, creates contacts, which later, when he leaves the nation, he taps people that he taps later, such as Anwar Sadat of Egypt. There's a really good novel that I'll recommend to people logged in called And Bid Him Sing by David Du Bois, who's the son of W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was living in Cairo, part of an African-American expat community, when Malcolm comes for the OAU conference of 1964. And it's a beautiful novel because it describes the visit in great detail and how he wanted to set up Bandung-style organizations in Harlem, including the Organization for Afro-American Unity, but also a branch of Al-Azhar University and a branch of the Muslim World League. all these different organizations. He wanted to set up branches here in Harlem. And just think of this man who dies at 39, navigating all these treacherous geopolitical waters, right? And what's striking about Malcolm is that it's his radical incompleteness, right? Which we don't know how he would have evolved or developed, so we tend to project our own ideological preferences onto him. It was an ongoing project, and he was deciding between, right? So if you look at the diary, it's first of all Black nationalism, and then allied with darkism, he calls darkism, Islam, and Orientalism, the world of the East, right? This is the vision that comes from the nation, right? And so he was deciding, he was drawn to Ghana with its socialist, Pan-African, Black nationalist vision. He liked Saudi Arabia for the orthodoxy, the Islamic orthodoxy. Also, they had a lot of money. And Egypt in particular, he was drawn to the balance between socialism, Pan-Africanism, Islam, and also, again, Nubia was central. So he's navigating these waters, and what's incredible is wherever he went, a community was framed, right? So you get a little community of African-American intellectuals and local allies in Accra, Ghana, in Tanzania. In Algiers, you get the Panthers. In Cairo, you get these Pan-Africanists with a Maoist leaning around Shirley Graham Du Bois, especially after the coup d'etat in Ghana. In Algiers, the Panthers. In Morocco, you get Sufi Pan-Africanists. And so his footprint today, and of course, Paris. I mean, I'll come back to Paris later, but Paris is a critical part of his legacy. There's a really good book called Black Paris, Paris Noir by Tyler Stovall at Berkeley. Came out in '96, but in the mid-'90s, he says there's a Malcolm X cult out in the suburbs of Paris, right? And he's talking about the history of the African-American community there. But you had a number of Panthers who settled in Paris, Algerian freedom fighters, people from across Francophone Africa. And so I'll leave it at that. The internationalism comes from the Nation of Islam, as does the practice. And then he takes that to the international level.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very well said. We've talked about the internationalism. We've talked about connecting these dots between the local and the global. But now I kind of want to start to become more specific. In the beginning of this talk, I sort of named how, as a Muslim woman, Malcolm X has greatly informed my own understanding of Islam and the faith that I practice. And has continued to actually influence my research, as well as I'm really interested in the intersection of surveillance and Islamic ethics, and how Muslims are using Islam to combat their issues in their lives, and more specifically state surveillance. And so, I'm really interested in the intersection of Malcolm's liberatory reading of Islam and his political understanding of oppression and injustice as it manifests in the world. Malcolm's practice of a liberatory understanding of Islam offers a broader framework through which we understand radical compassion and the importance of upholding intrinsic human worth. How can we recenter Malcolm's faith practice as central to his political work?
Yeah, that's another wonderful, wonderful question. And there's so many ways to think about that. Again, I would begin with the Nation of Islam. There will be people who will be uneasy with me beginning there because of these different interpretations of Islam, of Islamic theology, of people who will argue that the nation is heretic, etc. And while I don't want to wade into that debate for the purpose of this conversation, because I think it's beside the point, I would say that Malcolm's primary understanding of Islam is rooted in the Nation of Islam's theology. As Malcolm grows, as you point out, for example, Elijah Muhammad's son was, I believe it was Akbar, was at Al-Azhar. And when Malcolm was traveling to Egypt, he encountered him. Of course, he encountered Warith Muhammad. He encountered You know, as he went through time, Malcolm's Islam developed, his understanding developed. He rejected the idea that Master Fard Muhammad was Allah in person, right? He rejected Elijah Muhammad as being part of the prophethood, or being among the prophets, and he embraced a more traditional understanding of Muhammad ibn Abdullah as being the, you know, Khatam Anbiya. But when you talk about his fundamental belief, Malcolm's fundamental belief in the liberatory possibilities of Islam, it begins with the nation, and the nation's understanding of the faith was rooted in many ways in the liberation theology. Yeah. And a fundamental belief that, you know, in the Conanian tradition, in many ways, the Nation of Islam itself is rooted in has many of the tropes, many of the ideologies, many of the features of Black Christianity, particularly in its early stages, right? Ramadan was celebrated in December. It didn't move on the lunar calendar. Jummah prayer didn't happen on Yom Jummah. It didn't happen on Friday. It happened on Sunday, right? When people would be going to church. They were ministers. They weren't imams. So there's a way that the nation modeled itself after that. And when they would draw into the Exodus story, when the Nation of Islam would draw into the Exodus story, I mean, in many ways, when they talked about being children lost in the wilderness of North America, they were drawing on the Exodus story. Eddie Glaude talks about this in his first book many years ago on Exodus, right? This idea of how Black people would link themselves to the narratives of the Bible, and particularly Exodus as a way of understanding who they were in political possibility. So there was kind of a hermeneutic of possibility for them of liberation in the present moment. And so Malcolm's first understanding of Islam for Malcolm, the idea that Islam was liberatory was axiomatic. For him, to be a Muslim meant that you were committed to freedom. To be Muslim meant that you were committed to justice, right? And that's the stage where I would argue that there's no distinction between what the nation was doing at that time and what the global ummah was doing. And to the extent that they both understood at its best that Islam was about justice and liberation and freedom, and it was tied to a praxis. Now, at the very same time that this is happening, there's also a wide range of Arab nationalist movements happening, right? I mean, so you can also see what's happening from I would say from 1956, right? And maybe even 54, but certainly 56, when we're looking at the sort of the rise of Arab nationalism with Gamal Abdel Nasser formally in control and successfully beating off, you know, in some ways the first successful response to the 48 war. So you got this happening. And then from there until probably 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, you know, where you saw nation building, but not necessarily world making, right? Where you saw the Western colonial powers pushed out, but not necessarily replaced by a kind of liberatory framework or an alternate framework. It was imperialism by other means in a lot of ways. In between that time period, Malcolm is able to see what Muslims can do. So the vision of justice and freedom is there. He's rooted in that, in the Nation of Islam theology. But as Malcolm grows and develops, he understands that he understands that Islam and liberatory praxis in Islam is rooted in two principles, right? At least two principles, certainly two principles from the Quran, right? Ilm and amal, right? This idea of knowledge and this idea of action, right? That it's not enough to just know stuff. It's not enough to just do stuff. And so Malcolm's reading practice, Malcolm's investigation of the world, Malcolm's deep knowledge, you know, it's all bound up in his belief and in the belief that Muslims have a duty to leave the world better than they found it. They have a duty to produce justice, but they also have a duty to produce it for themselves, right? It's not just about acts of charity. It's about intervention. It's about saying that we have to engage in forms of action that leave our worlds better than we found it, and to impose justice in our worlds. And for Malcolm, that is in many ways an Islamic liberation theology that too often, I would argue, finally, has been reduced to what people will just call political Islam, right? Which then becomes in some ways, it becomes reframed or narrowly framed as fundamentalisms and very narrow forms of violence, as opposed to really understanding what it means for Muslims to fight anti-colonial struggle, anti-imperial struggle. And for me, that's what Islamic liberation theology was about. It wasn't just about creating justice. It was about fighting Western colonial power. It was about defeating imperialism. It was about producing justice. And that's why I say up until about 79, where I feel like it's like we're going to get rid of Western colonial power, but we're not necessarily producing justice in its place.
Right. And I love that you mentioned Black Christianity specifically. And I think there's this thread that ties into your last answer around who is the Ummah and this capacity for a global community of oppressed peoples, right? And I think we make these boxes of, you know, this person's Muslim, this person's not Muslim, this person's within the faith, this person's not within the faith. But I think when we're starting to frame Malcolm's cosmology and Malcolm's world-making practice, it is far more radically inclusive in so many ways than we've lend credit to it. So thank you so much for that answer. Najha, would you like to jump into that question?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to just kind of start by saying this is, I didn't grow up in the Muslim tradition. It's not a religious tradition that I really studied, but being able to be at the Shabazz Center and learning on the ground and being in these sorts of conversations is actively, you know, my praxis-oriented education. And so I'm grateful for that. And so what I'm able to offer is somewhat limited, but I do think about James Cone, who you mentioned, and Black liberation theology as being really central to expanding, you know, the hermeneutical lens in which people understand religious practice to be, that it's not just, you know, where one is praying, but like, what does it mean to be a Black person? What does it mean to be human, to be a person of faith in the face of oppression? And I think that that's a thread that ties, that expands beyond one religious tradition. And so I think a lot about the work of James Cone, and I wanted to pull up a quote in a book that the late great Reverend James Hal Cone wrote, Black Liberation Theology. And he's also, you know, New Yorker, Harlemite at Union Theological Seminary. And there's a section in his book which really has impacted a lot about how I think about liberation theology. And I think it's really pertinent to this conversation around Malcolm X. And it's a section from The Human Being as Endowed with Freedom. And Cone writes, if the context, and this is within obviously a Black religious, Black Christian context that I'm speaking from. In the context of the gospel, if the context of the gospel is liberation, human existence must be explained as being free, which means rebellion against every form of slavery, the suppression of everything creative. To be human is to be free, and to be free is to be human. The liberated, the free, are the ones who define the meaning of their being in terms of the oppressed of the land by participating in their liberation, fighting against everything that opposes integral humanity. Only the oppressed are truly free. And I think that this quote is so beautiful, and it's completely animated how I think about Black liberation theology. And it led, you know, this is what led me to go to divinity school, like this particular quote and James Cone's work, because he reframes to be human in a very active, oriented sense, that we must be engaged in oppression work or anti-oppression work. We must be engaged in the creative work that goes into building up our humanity and ensuring that we're asking everyone to be fully human in that process. And I think that's the crux of liberation theology. And I think that it's also a thread that connects both Christian Black liberation theology to Islamic Islamic liberation theology. And it's something that Malcolm wrestled with and exemplified to the highest degree. And again, he talks about what does it mean to expand our notion of civil rights to one of fundamental human rights. And so I see Malcolm X as constantly wrestling with what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live in a world that allows us to be fully human? And liberation theology at its core wrestles with this question and offers a new cosmological context in which we can all live in. And it really expands the notion of humanity. And so even though I'm talking about Christianity, Black liberation theology, I think it's a thread that connects to this question in a really fundamental way.
Right. That was so beautifully said. And I think, as a non-Black person myself, one thing that I'm constantly telling, other young folks that I'm, in conversation with, or sometimes elders, is that, as non-Black Muslims here, we are inheritors of a radical Black Muslim tradition, and we are living within that context, right? And so our faith is shaped in so many ways, whether we realize it or not actively, by a massive context and hundreds of years of legacy. And I think that connects kind of to, what you're saying, Najha, in terms of Christianity. And I love that we're invoking Black Christianity in this, because as Muslims, we are inheritors of that rich legacy as well. And so thank you so much for that answer. Professor Hisham, I'm wondering if you have some ideas around this as well.
I can talk about this for hours, but just give me a few minutes. In terms of liberation theology, Malcolm was searching for a liberation theology, but his search would lead others to try to develop one. And the people who are interested in Malcolm today, particularly young Muslims, you mentioned young Muslims, are looking for a liberation theology. If you look at the state of the Islamic theological landscape, if you will, it's dominated by the right. You have your you have your Salafis, your Muslim Brotherhood on the right. You have the alt-right, or the Ak-right, as some call them. You have the Sufis in the center, but there's no left. There really is no left. For all of France is panicking about Islamo-Gauchism, there really isn't an organized Islamic left to speak of. That speaks of gender inequality and racism and injustice and links militarism and imperialism to freedom and domestic politics and so on. So young Muslims tend to gravitate towards what? They tend to gravitate towards the Black Muslim experience, towards the Black Muslim archive, and to Malcolm, personified by Malcolm. Now, I've been so I'm an immigrant, right? I came as a 16-year-old, spent a couple of years. A lot of this happened in Philadelphia, by the way. My being immersed in all of this is early 90s hip hop in Philadelphia. That'll do it, right, Marc? And then I've been here for over 25 years, and almost every year on May 19th, I go up to Ferncliff Cemetery for the pilgrimage to Malcolm's grave. So I've watched this pilgrimage evolve and change over the years, over the decades. It used to be a small affair, mostly people from Harlem, African-American community, from around the country, but mostly Harlem elders, speeches honoring Malcolm. But over the last 15, 20 years, you're seeing people from around the world. You're seeing Australian Muslims, English Muslims, French, Austrians. I've met Austrians there. And the whole ceremony has taken on a particular Muslim character. There are offerings. People refer to it as a mosim, pilgrimage, as a urs, as a marriage with our beloved. And I think much of this business of, usually if you grow up in the diaspora and you feel disaffected, you want to study pure Islam, you go to the East, you go to Pakistan or Yemen, and you come back with wearing a robe and a bit of an accent and so on, right? But now I'm seeing this journey across the Atlantic, for young people from Paris and London and Berlin who come to the US to immerse themselves in Black history and Black theology, looking for some sort of liberation theology. And Najha, thanks for mentioning James Cone. I mentioned in my opening that Malcolm would inspire a number of movements and counter movements, right? So one of the first things he said was that Christianity is a white man's religion, right? That would inspire James Cone, right? I often wonder, what if Malcolm had said something like that about Islam? If he had made a forceful critique while in Mecca or Medina or Cairo or wherever, what kind of response would have gotten? But I'm going to say just briefly, Malcolm is often accused of having been silent on three things, his critics, right? He was silent on authoritarianism in Africa. He didn't call out, he should have called out, right? He didn't call out the head of Kwame Nkrumah or Nasser or the Saudis and so on. And this creates a position, in the years after his death, a critique emerges, an entire movement emerges that's saying he was silent on racism in the Middle East, ethnic and racial domination in the Middle East, ethnic and racial domination in Africa, and authoritarianism. And from these so-called silences, you get three movements critiquing it. Right? You get the neoconservative movement, a lot of people, I mean, much has been said about neoconservatism, right? It's a response to the '67 war and the position of Soviet Jewry, but it's also a response to Malcolm and Black Power and the declaration of solidarity with Palestine and Afro-Arab solidarity. How to contain that? The way to contain that is by saying Islam is anything but colorblind, and we need to talk about racism. Bernard Lewis's book in 1971, Color and Prejudice in Islam, is a response to the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's a response to the Hajj Epiphany, right? I mean, Malcolm died at 39, right? So he can't have done everything. And his position was, I'm fully aware of these ethnic tensions and racism and so on. Look at the interview he did with WBLS Radio when he came back in 1964. But my point here is that he would inspire a number of movements, which I want to give you the movements, I mean, maybe later, but also counter movements. And the counter movements are the ones who said, he didn't talk about whatever, ethnic domination in Africa, right? And when the anti-apartheid movement begins mobilizing here, that's the critique that happens. From Malcolm to Randall Robinson, why don't you talk about Rwanda or Congo? What's your obsession with South Africa? And from the neoconservative camp, why talk about Palestine when you should be talking about Yemen and Saudi and this and so on? But it's just incredible how many discourses he shaped after his death. Mm-hmm. Right? And the debates are still ongoing. These people are still waging war against Malcolm for having been silent on this, that, or the other. The man died at 39. He can't have addressed anything. And he deliberately, I mean, his position was, they have just gained independence, these states. They need to consolidate power. Right? The enemy right now is imperialism and white supremacy, and we need to create some sort of Bandung movement that'll support Black nationalist organizations in the US.
That's, yeah, I mean, it's giving me so much to reflect on. And I think, you know, in particular, we keep coming back to this space of he left us so young and he only had so much time. And how much do we project onto people? You know, Malcolm, there's Malcolm as a person and there's Malcolm as the legend that sort of exceeds him. And we've, you know, Marc's talked, we've all talked about this, of how we've connected to him as a legend, essentially, and everything he left behind for us. And specifically I'm fascinated by the folks you're mentioning who come on this pilgrimage now, and how that small community continues to grow. It's I think quite interesting. I want to talk about something that might feel.
Sumaiya, is it okay? I actually have another question, if that's okay, before we move forward. Two things. One, Marc, I know you just came out with an excellent book, Except for Palestine, which is important. So
good.
Lift it up, show the people. Yes. I mean, I'm just curious, and obviously you have so much knowledge around this, but I think that this is also the question, and Hisham, you're talking, well, two things I'm thinking about. I think one, if we're to really examine Malcolm's work, we understand that his liberatory view of the world is inherently all-encompassing. And of course, one might not be able to talk about every single thing and address every single person. But I think that, at least how I understand Malcolm's ideological vision, is a fully encompassing liberation project that can't leave anyone out. And I was the part, I got to hear a beautiful conversation with Ilyasa Shabazz, Professor Herboy, Baba Zaid Muhammad, Lamont Badeli, Akemi Kochiyama, Robin Spencer, just like an all-star lineup yesterday as we honored the 56th commemoration of Malcolm X's martyrdom. And one of the points that was made, and I was also, you know, reading, but just the ways in which Malcolm also elevated women and elevated their leadership positions in his work with the OAAU and beyond. And we know that when he was abroad in Ghana, he was learning from Shirley Graham Du Bois and others. And so I think it's important to name this, but you know, I'm saying that, but I also want to go back to you, Marc, because I think this is an important space to also talk about the ways in which Malcolm's world-making practice is connected to occupation and Palestine, and what should we understand, what do we take away from that? I'm just hoping you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, you know, again, Malcolm was such a visionary on this issue. There was a general sort of support among Black leadership in the first half of the 20th century for the Zionist project. There's a complex story to it that I think we have to at some point tell, so that we don't reduce Black leaders to just being duped, or, as Robin Kelly said, or to just not being sophisticated on this issue. There was a very particular reason why Marcus Garvey, for example, or W.E.B. Du Bois, or to an extent Martin King, although he shifts by 68, he begins to shift by 68. Why these people would be supportive of the Zionist project. And the reason was that Black leadership understood they understood racial oppression, and they understood that Jews in Europe were under deep forms of oppression, and Jews everywhere were under attack. They were hated, subject to random violence. The pogroms of Poland and Russia were evident. There was a very clear sense that Jews were oppressed, and that they were a group that was facing violence largely from Europe. And so there was a way that Black folk were like, yeah, that looks familiar. And if you could achieve liberation through the creation of a state where you could be protected from white supremacy, where you could be protected from a violent state, etc., that made sense. And so you saw a great deal of support in the first half of the 20th century. What makes Malcolm so interesting and so fascinating was that he was part of that wave, the kind of post-48, post-Ralph Bunche, and really more importantly, probably post-Schuller moment, where he was saying, we got to look at this thing differently. Now, after 1967, right, 2 years after Malcolm passes, 2.5 years almost after Malcolm passes, we have the 6-Day War, where more people got on board. Suddenly, SNCC was like, oh, wait a minute. Ethel Miner's like, oh, I see what's happening here. King, doesn't go to Jerusalem, or doesn't go to Jerusalem, or what he called the Holy Land. He writes the Prime Minister of Israel and says, I can't go, for a couple of reasons, but largely because he saw the occupation now. But Malcolm saw it before that, and Malcolm saw it in different terms. Malcolm, remember, Malcolm had set foot in Jerusalem before in the end of the 50s, in 59, I believe. And then he spent time in 2 days in Gaza in 64, September, of 64. He went to Khan Yunis, which is like a refugee camp. He saw what was happening, and he writes an essay in 64 called Zionist Logic, right, in the Egyptian Gazette. Think about this. What Black leader is not only traveling in this way and engaging the question in this way, but writing a sophisticated critique of Zionism on the global stage? This was something different. Malcolm marks a pivot point in Black thinking on Palestine. Again, he's not the first, but he was the most public, the most visible. And I understand the Nation of Islam also had sophisticated critiques of this. And if you look through the 60s and even the 70s, Muhammad Speaks would be one of the few places where you could hear about Palestinian oppression and Palestinian resistance to oppression, and where there were favorable representations of the PLO, which is founded in 64, right around the time that Malcolm is engaging in these questions. But Malcolm understood it. Malcolm talked about camouflage. Malcolm uses the language of camouflage. He says that this is colonialism by other means. He said, this looks like it's different than what Europe was doing, but what was happening in Palestine is camouflage. This is colonialism. He said at the end of the essay on Zionist Logic, he said, the Moors lived in Spain less than 1,000 years ago. What if they went back right now and kicked out all the Spaniards? Would that be cool? Malcolm understood. He talked about the language of dollarism, right? Talking about the exploitation of land, not just in historic Palestine, but also on the continent of Africa, also in Latin America. Malcolm understood this and had sophisticated analysis of it. Malcolm meets with Harun Hashim Rashid, who's a Palestinian poet, and begins to, really just develop and nurture this stuff. This is sharply contrasted to what Du Bois had done in 48. Sharply contrasted. When he wrote, I think it was the question of ethics in Ethics and the Problem of Palestine or something like that. It became called the Jewish question later, right? But Malcolm is so ahead of the curve on this because, and it wasn't just a blip, and this is why we have to be very careful about how we biographize Malcolm. You know, there are many critiques of Manning Marable's biography, but one of them is Malcolm. I mean, Manning Marable talks about Malcolm's trips to the Middle East and his statements on Gaza and his statements on Palestine in real passing terms, and he frames it as Malcolm, almost like Malcolm was just trying to be radical and he just went along with critiques of Israel, as opposed to Malcolm having a sophisticated politics that was rooted in his entire political formation from day one until day 39. I mean, we don't do enough to appreciate how sophisticated Malcolm's thinking was on this. And so for me, and again, that's tied to also Malcolm's theology. Just to take it back to the other thing, for Malcolm, Tawheed, this idea of oneness, which comes up in the letter from Jeddah, right? Malcolm talks about the oneness of Allah as being a mechanism not just for this challenging other forms of Islam, but for embracing revolutionary, for embracing a kind of a rejection of whiteness, right? For rejecting imperialism, for rejecting colonialism. And so for Malcolm, Palestine was a major case study of that. It wasn't the only one, but it was a major one. It wasn't because he was just trying to make friends with Gamal Abdel Nasser, like Manning Marable says. It's not just because he didn't know any better. It wasn't because Malcolm had some anti-Semitic basilisk, which is what some people have implied through others. Malcolm wasn't anti-Semitic. Malcolm wasn't a puppet. Malcolm was brilliant, self-assured, clear-headed, and understood that the liberation of Palestine was bound up in other liberation projects, which is exactly what he tells us in Message to the Grassroots. He's just living this out. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on, but it's a point that I think is really worth underscoring.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Najha, for drawing attention to that. It's definitely, we were trying to find some way of bringing Palestine very intentionally into the conversation. So thank you for that beautiful reminder. I think now that we're becoming more and more specific, right? We've talked about internationalism, we've talked about theology. I think it's important to recognize that this conversation is happening in the context of a fraught relationship between Columbia and the Harlem community, one which represents a historically inequitable and white supremacist relationship. Malcolm's framework of people's power offers a new structure for us to imagine community relationships grounded in freedom and sovereignty, as we've talked about so far. How can we employ this framework to understand, decolonize, and restructure the dynamics of power between white supremacist institutions, in this case, Columbia as part of the Ivy League project, and the Harlem community, just wanting to bring this, more specificity in this conversation. And we've talked about praxis, so wanting to bring that in as well.
I guess that's for me. Before I talk about Columbia, I just again, Marc, congrats on the book. It's a brave book, and it's a topic that needs to be. It's a fascinating topic. It needs to be broached. But for the Pan-Africanists, starting with Blyden, they were all sympathetic to the Zionist project because they saw a parallel between the Black condition and the Jewish condition, the predicament. And Blyden would write to Herzl and would write positively about Herzl. Marcus Garvey would speak of that marvelous movement. W.B. Du Bois would launch the Pan-African Congress shortly after the Balfour Declaration, hoping that Balfour could help African diaspora that way. Similarly with Garvey, he wrote to Prime Minister Balfour hoping for another Liberia or a bigger Liberia and so on. But Malcolm was the first to offer I would say Du Bois after 56 writes a poem where he begins to distance himself, but Malcolm makes a very clean critique, sort of a very clean break and a very sharp critique in 64. And interestingly, after that, he starts talking about the Chinese diaspora as a model. right? No longer the Jewish diaspora. About Colombia, I mean, look, I don't have that kind of juice at Colombia, but there's a lot that I wish Colombia could do. The first thing they could do, you know, Colombia has a number of global centers around the world, in Tunis, in Chile, in Istanbul. First thing they can do is they can make the Shabazz Center a global center for the study of Malcolm X and Black liberationist thought. That's the first thing they could do. Second thing they could do, they could set up a public humanities or a public history program where they send professors and students to help set up archives and so on at the Shabazz Center, but offer classes to the community on gentrification, social movements, decoloniality, Black history, migration, and so on. This is one of the few campuses in the world, in America, where it's an incredibly wealthy, property-owning institution abutting against a very marginalized, struggling neighborhood, right? So you can, there are many ways you can bridge that gap. Something else Colombia could do. I used to run a tutorial program in schools here, run through International House. Colombia could set up programs. Colombia, I've always dreamt of Colombia setting up a prison education program similar to the one that Bard College has. Why not send our students up to whatever penitentiary? Speaking of penitentiaries, let me mention this just on the power of the text of the autobiography of Malcolm X. I have a friend who's a chaplain in the Boston area. I haven't seen him in a few years, but I was once talking to him, and I was about to give a talk on this topic, and he says, I use the autobiography of Malcolm X in prison. What I do is I teach Malcolm's pre-Hajj chapters, the pre-Hajj part of the book, along with the Meccan surahs before the Hijrah, and the post-Hajj Malcolm, along with the Medina surahs, right? And he says, and I assign the first, right, to people who are on the inside on shorter sentences, right? Pre-Hajj and the Meccan surahs, and the second part for people who are on the inside for life. So this is a text that has enormous emancipatory and positive and potential for people everywhere, right? And the role of urban periphery and its appendage, the prison system, is critical to understanding Malcolm, right? And his ability to give people meaning and structure in their lives.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
So powerful. Najha, I see you contemplating. If you like to jump in here.
Yeah, oh my God, there's so much to say and think of. Well, firstly, I mean, as a resident of Harlem, I've seen the ways in which Columbia has interacted with my community at a very visceral level. And I've seen my community change, the geographic landscape of this community change, which in some ways is exciting, but then also we know it's been detrimental in many ways. And firstly, I think there's so much to say with this question, and I think Malcolm X offers such a beautiful action-oriented social justice framework that we can employ. He did this he thought about power dynamics at a global level, but we can really take all of the brilliance that he offered and think about how do we restructure and reframe the relationships that we have, and how do we, in Adrienne Marie Brown's word, how do we get in right relationship with each other and the communities that we're part of? And I think that's what we need to do in activating Malcolm's legacy. But I first want to say one of the things that I learned when joining the Shabazz Center is the work that happened historically, led by Dr. Betty Shabazz, whose brilliance is, the reason that we're here, is the reason that the Shabazz Center stands. It's because of Julio Peterson, who's a board member, Ilyasa Shabazz, and other community members fought to keep the Audubon Ballroom standing. The Columbia University wanted to raise the Audubon Ballroom as part of their the expansion of the biotechnology campus in Washington Heights. And community members said, no, this is a historic landmark. This space has cultural, religious significance for us, and how dare anyone ever think of coming into a community and raising that center so you can build whatever it is that you want to build. And so that's the context in which the Shabazz Center exists within. And as we know, that's where Malcolm organized with the OAAU. That's where Dr. Betty Shabazz taught and organized. And that's also where he was killed 56 years ago, yesterday to the day. And so that's the context in which we're working to restore and think through these new dynamics of relationality. And it's important to understand, and just as I would say that Columbia is like an imperial expansionist project, as are all Ivy League schools, with billions and trillions of dollars that they get from investing in things like the prison system, from fossil fuels, and just like a whole lot of crap. And Harvard, where I went, is really no different. If not, they're the worst of the worst. And so it's important to just be honest of that. And it's important to recognize that we should never be of those institutions. We can be at those institutions, but we're not of the institution. And so, and with that context, I think we can really, and also before I even say something else, I'd like to say that, you know, Columbia, New York City, a lot of these institutions house such rich archives around Malcolm X's work and Black radical scholarship. And this is something Dr. Robin Spencer said, and this is, you know, Professor Aidi, Professor Saidiya Hartman, all talk about history and archives. And what does it mean to be a steward of a Black radical archive? It doesn't mean that you just hold it and that, you know, folks in your community can access it, or your educational institution, but it means that you're employing a particular pedagogy, a particular praxis in being a steward of this material. And so I see Columbia as being charged with a call to not only hold such brilliant knowledge that's been produced by professors and students alike, but to really disseminate and work in community with people so we can activate this history. And lastly, you know, I think a lot about the work of M4BL, of Dream Defenders, BYP 100, and all of the, all of the Black, not progressive, but radical youth-led movement work that's happening today. And I think about the work of abolition. Some people are afraid of abolition. A lot of people are really excited about it. I'm really excited about it. And really beyond just, you know, taking money away from prisons, closing prisons, ending our police state, which we know just doesn't work and is a white supremacist project rooted in slavery and wanting to enslave Black folks. I think abolition is exciting because it offers a framework through which we can rethink about how do we build communities? How do we invest in communities in ways that are life-giving and sustainable, and in ways that allow us to thrive? Because we know that, like, this moment we're existing in with late stage racial capitalism, things are not working, and we need to rethink how we engage with each other in this world. And abolition fundamentally is a project of imagination that forces us to rethink what it means to build community and to be in community. And so, you know, maybe I agree. I don't think, you know, we should be thinking about what would Malcolm have done, what would he have said, or placing him in these, like, you know, offering words that he might or might not have used. But I'm really interested in this idea of abolition as something that allows us to rethink building the communities that we need. And if Columbia, and, you know, starting with this conversation, if we're going to be in relationship with Columbia, if we're going to exist in Harlem, which holds so much beautiful history, then I think it's really important to examine and actually put into praxis the work that Malcolm did, that he gave us all, that it's not simply an intellectual project, but it's a framework, a modality through which we can live and recreate and restructure the dynamics between institutions, between people, power, and in a way that centers Black folks, in a way that also really creates a material change, not just an intellectual change, but, you know, their lives at stake. And so I think that the Shabazz Center it's a brilliant project that has existed within our community because it sits at the nexus of all of these spaces and allows us to really engage Malcolm's legacy in an action-oriented way.
Right. Oh my God. I wish I could stand up and clap right now if that was appropriate. But you're also getting so much love in the chats, Najha, by the way. I think one thing that I think is so important to highlight, that is a thread between what Professor Hisham has said and what you have said, Najha, like this action-oriented framework, you know, there are things that can be done. There are things that are being done, right? Like this partnership is is in existence, and there have been interactions, and but I think one thing that you pointed to that is so important not to lose sight of is that we are individuals connected to institutions, and institutions are the very entities that are perpetuating structural and systemic harm. And so as individuals, I'm so wary of, like, you know, we're people who are, as you said so brilliantly, we are not of the institution, we are at the institution. And these institutions have existed long before anyone on this panel was even allowed to attend these institutions. And if, like you said, they will continue to exist, then we must find a way to build equity in that space of time currently. So thank you so much for that. Marc, is there anything else that you want to add? No? Okay.
Oh, they knocked that out the park.
They really did. I feel so blessed right now to even just be in this space with you guys virtually. Those are essentially the questions that we have as an event, but there are like 100 questions in the chat. If we have a couple minutes to field some of them, how are we feeling in terms of time? We have a couple minutes.
I'm here, I'm ready.
Okay.
I can hang out till whatever. Just keep going.
we can have a whole party. Awesome. There's a couple that really stuck out to me. I think the first one that I want to sort of go to is this question that is so interesting. How do we continue to uplift and respond to the truths and ideas lived out by leaders like Malcolm without forwarding a kind of cult of a personality? I think we've talked a little bit about this so far, but I think there might be more to be said, even just around, you know, the reductionism that has sort of happened.
Yeah, I think part of it is highlighting people's contradictions. You know, finding spaces of disagreement. I'll just use the Palestine issue as one example. You know, every year on Martin Luther King's birthday, I'll give a big shout out to Martin Luther King and say that he's extraordinary, you know, in all these ways. He's one of the greatest Americans we've ever produced. And then I'll get it in the last couple of years since I've been doing the Palestine work, I'll get those people saying, well, he was a Zionist. What do you say now? And I'm like, he was wrong. One, he wasn't a Zionist, but King wasn't a Zionist, but beyond that, like, let's say he was, then King was wrong. And that's okay, right? That's fine. King could be an amazing person and wrong on this issue. But if we start holding people up once they leave us, even in the sort of martyrdom, if we hold them up as perfect, I think that's troublesome. I think part of what makes Malcolm such an amazing figure is that Malcolm himself was very open to changing, right? Malcolm talked about his greatest asset being his sincerity, right? Malcolm was principled and disciplined and sincere. So Malcolm would engage an idea, and if at some moment he realized that he was wrong, he would say, you know what, I got this wrong, and now I think about this differently. And so for me, even recognizing that Malcolm himself didn't hold himself to a standard of perfection, a standard of excellence, yes, but standard of perfection, no, we want to be better. If we understand that, then I think that's what, so when I engage these people's legacies, Malcolm or whomever, I engage it from a place of critical engagement, of critical generosity, right? Meaning, because, you know, one thing that happens in grad school is you open up the book and the first thing you do is tear the author up. All grad students are like training to say, here's what's wrong with this thesis. It's easy to find what's wrong with the thesis. What was the person arguing first, right? What was the case they were trying to make first, right? Let's begin by understanding the project. Understand Malcolm's project, engage Malcolm's project, but take it very seriously. It's serious enough to critique it. And then we don't fall into that space of perfection. Perfection. It doesn't mean that we wallow in the tawdry either. It doesn't mean that we try to find, blemishes that don't have anything to do with the person's broader legacy. It means that we try to understand them as full human beings. And I think when we do that, we're much less likely to deify them. And that's why I love the fact that people on this panel are like, well, I don't know what Malcolm would say to gentrification in Harlem right now, but I don't think we need to, right? Because there are other people speaking about those issues, right? And so we can use Malcolm's legacy and Malcolm's insights to bring something to bear on the conversation, but we don't want to ever turn into we don't want to turn these people into literal prophets, but rather instead thinking about them as sort of guideposts and people from whom we can learn great lessons.
Awesome. And I love that you said there are other people speaking on this issue, because it's so true. And I think sometimes we get lost in the sauce of like, what would this person have said, and why aren't we bringing Malcolm to the present right now? And I love that you use the term generosity, because it's part of that same humanity we're naming, that folks are fighting for, we're fighting for ourselves, is this humanity of even being able to make a mistake. And I'm thinking about that on an intellectual level, but also on a personal level as well in this work and in this context. Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to take? Yeah.
I like the wallow in the tawdry. Let's not wallow in the tawdry. I'm gonna borrow that. On cult of personality, that is interesting. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is sort of the articulations of Malcolm around the world. And I always say there are sort of three articulations. There's the first coming, where Malcolm appears in the 50s, 60s, dies in 65. And after him, you get people inspired by him domestically, Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement. You do then get posers and a sort of cult of personalities, but they don't last. But then you get actual leaders who are truly inspired and they build movements. In England, you get the Black Power movement in England, led by Abdul Malik, who met Malcolm at 1964, I think early 65, during the Oxford debates, right? So you get a movement, Black Power movement in England. Then you get a Black Panther movement where? In Israel, right? The Israeli Black Panthers, right? With the T-shirts and the fist up and so on. Then you get the Maori Black Panthers in New Zealand, the Polynesian Black Panthers. And then you get the Dalit Black Panthers, and they're still going strong to a certain degree. So that's the first coming, and then you have some references to Malcolm and music in the 70s and so on, particularly in Philadelphia. And then in the 90s, hip hop resurrects Malcolm. And then you get the Malcolmania in the US, and it was incredible. I mean, the American part of it was incredible, but also overseas. Because overseas, the music and the internet and Spike Lee's film broadcast Black history, the African-American struggle, the liberation theology you were talking about. And you begin to get hip hop scenes around the world where people are actually either embracing Islam or some sort of Black political identity, right? They're articulating their political positions in a distinctly African-American idiom, right? From Sao Paulo to Istanbul, to Berlin, to other parts of the world, but again, particularly Paris in the 90s, right? After 9/11, you get the third coming, or the third resurrection, right? Which is, you get this spate of movements after 9/11. You get a range of movements after 9/11. You get the Black Panthers in Paris, led by Kemi Seba, who was a student of Khalid Mohammed. You get the Panterarna in Gothenburg, Sweden. You get the Black Panthers in Greece. You get the Arab European League in, of all places, Antwerp, Belgium, not a place where you expect to get radical political agitation, but you do, and it's inspired by, it's people who've sort of been weaned on hip hop and weaned on American, particularly African American culture, and so you do get these cult of personality, but you also get serious movement that governments want to contain. After 2001, governments begin to pay attention to the autobiography of Malcolm X. I remember on C-SPAN a few months after 9/11. I think it was Shelby Steele holding up the autobiography of Malcolm X, saying this is the problem. This is why John Walker Lynn, this kid from Northern California, ended up with the Taliban. Remember, Marc will remember this, right?
Yes, very well.
This is the radicalizer, right? We have to deal with this. And then you get American embassies overseas trying to contain what parts of Malcolm are referenced in hip hop tracks overseas. The embassy in London puts out a statement. Well, somebody who works for the embassy saying, we hope they can stress the post-Hajj Malcolm, right? The more moderate Malcolm. And then 2011, the so-called Arab Spring. And I always note that, so in the 2000s, mid-2000s, after 9/11 era, you get Europe, you get a great deal of interest in Malcolm in Europe as minorities mobilize, but also Latin America, Afro-Latin communities, Brazil, Cuba, Colombia, but also Middle East Africa, where it's more specifically, the debate is more specifically Islamic, right? And I always show people an article in Al-Akhbar from Egypt, how 10 years ago, I guess, 2011, when the uprisings were in full swing, the bestsellers, there were two bestsellers, right? The autobiography of Malcolm X and a biography of Che Guevara, right? Translations. Anytime the left stirs in this part of the world, there's interest in Malcolm, and you get a new translation in Turkish or Arabic or whatever, right? So yes, there are some, I guess, charlatans, but there are also some very serious political activists and people committed to freedom and connecting with marginalized communities around the world.
And I think I'm actually loving that hip hop is coming up again and again. And there are actually questions about music and art and hip hop in the chat, which I want to get to at some point. But before we get to that, Najha, was there anything else you wanted to add to that question, or?
I'll just, yeah, let's keep going. I know there's a lot of questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Hisham, for that answer. There's a really fascinating question in here. And this person is saying that they're wondering if the panelists could speculate on Malcolm's reception and accessibility in mainstream liberal circles after the movement for Black Lives. CNN has recently tried to put up a more sort of leftist persona after Trump, but they couldn't tolerate, for example, Marc saying certain things. Do you think the context today is ripe for Malcolm's legacy to be received differently? And I know we've talked about, not placing Malcolm in certain situations, essentially non-consensually, I would say. But also I think there's something in there about liberalism and the state of liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, Malcolm wasn't a liberal. And so, Malcolm won't be received properly in mainstream liberal circles because his politics weren't that. I mean, think about in November of '63, when he gives the message to the grassroots speech, right? Malcolm we'd had the March on Washington. We'd had a liberal march, an extraordinary event, to be sure. But Malcolm was saying, what are you fighting for? And what, you want a Black revolution or do you want a Negro revolution? Right? Because, Negro revolutions, you might be fighting to be able to use the same toilet as some folk, right? The Black revolution is about something else. And here's what's at stake when you have a Black revolution. It's about land. It includes bloodshed, right? And he goes around the world, again, invoking China, invoking Kenya, and Malcolm is making the argument very clearly that his decision between the Black revolution and Negro revolution, that he was rejecting Black liberalism, that Malcolm had a more, I think, ambitious, inclusive, and humane freedom dream, but also a more radical one. And so, Malcolm's name has been used more in mainstream circles. It's now safe to say Malcolm X in Black on the news, or wherever. But if we're talking about Malcolm's actual political vision, his actual project, I think it runs counter in many ways to what Black liberals are trying to do. And so when I hear Assata's name or Malcolm's name or other folks' names, sometimes I'm like, oh, this is great. It's dragging people back to where we need to be. But at other times, I feel like we're simply co-opting the legacy. And that's why, again, I'm gonna say this one more time. Malcolm's post-Hajj letters and identity and representation in the public imagination, particularly the mainstream liberal sphere, is so dangerous when it's misinterpreted. Malcolm did not go to Mecca, see white people, and then get converted. Right? First of all, Malcolm had seen white people before. Malcolm had seen white Muslims before. Malcolm had been to the Middle East before. It wasn't about that. Malcolm didn't suddenly become colorblind when he's in Mecca. What Malcolm said was, what Malcolm was recognizing, again, in sophisticated fashion, much like Du Bois in 35, I believe, with Black Reconstruction, was the idea that there's something about American constructions of whiteness that we have to dismantle, right? He was saying those people, he said, what makes these white people in Mecca, he was saying that what he was rejecting was an ontological claim about white people. He was saying that white people aren't evil biologically. They're no longer who is the color maniac, who's grafted devil, the skunk on the planet Earth. It was no longer lessons 1 to 10, number 2, right? He was saying something differently. He was saying that whiteness is a social construction that Americans have sort of been unable to avoid. And I'm sure the more Malcolm grew, he would be talking about this around the globe. But Malcolm was saying that whiteness is what we have to dismantle. That white privilege and white power are things that we have to dismantle, right? And so these white people who are drinking from the Zamzam, or these white people, if at their best, are okay because they haven't bought into that other thing. They haven't bought into the psychic wages of whiteness, as Du Bois talked about. But what liberals have done is simply say Malcolm now loved all white people and was backtracking on all of his critiques of whiteness and white people. And Malcolm was not doing that. He was offering a more sophisticated analysis that we now use. So no, there's no room for Malcolm. Ain't no room for Malcolm on CNN. Ain't no room for Malcolm in Black liberal circles. Ain't no room for Malcolm. Not without making them change, not without making them uncomfortable. I'm not saying there's no room for Malcolm in the sense they don't love and accept Malcolm. I'm saying Malcolm would disrupt them. He would unhinge them from their presuppositions. He would force them to wrestle with their own contradictions. Do you want to be free or do you not? And if you're not willing to make these sacrifices, like Malcolm said, then take freedom out of your vocabulary. That's what he would be saying to them Negroes.
Period. I have something to add. Yes. I think that liberalism serves liberalism. And Marc, you made such an important point about, whiteness working in the likeness of whiteness. I think there's, oh my God, there's so much I'm thinking about, but one, especially in this kind of like post BLM, like new white awakening that people are having around race, there's an important distinction that always needs to be made, especially for white folks, between like the brilliance of Black radical thought as its own cosmological world and anti-racism, and that they can serve each other, but that they're two separate things. And I think it's easy for liberal folks and liberal news media, academia, whatever the project is, to serve anti-racism and to serve whiteness, which I think is fundamentally limited to conceptions of whiteness. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't fully encompass liberationist projects in the way that Black power does, and that Malcolm's work did and continues to do. And I think we constantly, and the beautiful thing about Malcolm X is that he can never be taken from us because he belongs to the people, he is of the people. And so I don't think we ever really have to worry about, what's gonna happen with his legacy, but we have to continue to have these sorts of conversations to reframe, refocus the real breadth of his life as evolving and as really having significance in this moment. But I don't know, I don't think that the liberal media will ever be able to understand Malcolm because they don't understand themselves. And what I mean by that is I think whiteness is very inward focused, but it also doesn't allow for like a deep ontological dive into like, what does it mean to be human? Black folks, and Du Bois talks about this, we have double, triple, like quadruple consciousness. How do we live in our own bodies? How do we exist in this own world? But oftentimes I see whiteness operating in a way that doesn't really allow white folks to fully examine their own humanity and be in touch with their own humanity. And I think that's why one is able to be so racist, so ignorant, so whatever it is. And the project of whiteness allows that, it also necessitates that. And so, if liberal media, the liberal project is something that's firmly tethered to whiteness as a construct, as a social construct, I don't think we're ever going to really be able, or one would never be able to fully understand Malcolm. And so to really engage Malcolm in this moment of anti-racism means to deconstruct and understand what whiteness means for white folks, and also the implications for folks of color and for Black folks. And so, I think it's just a distinction I want to make, because sometimes people are like, sharing things at the Shabazz Center, or things that, Black folks are putting together, and be like, read this on your like anti-racism 101 training. And I'm like, no, That's disrespectful, because this is some really brilliant work that isn't, you know, Robin DiAngelo and like, or whatever her name is, Robin something, I don't know. But you know, I just want to say that because it's important, and that's part of reclaiming Malcolm's legacy, and it's part of doing the praxis-oriented work of putting this radical, you know, ideology, and it's an everyday praxis that's ultimately rooted in our liberation and rooted in being able to understand and know ourselves, live with ourselves, live in community with others. So that's really, you know, I just want to make that point. I think it's really important.
I'm left speechless.
Yeah. You know, some people are uncomfortable with that, but I think it's part of the moment that we're living in, and really being truthful with what does it mean to keep track of this history and employ this history in real time.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anything, Professor Hisham, that you wanted to add to?
I agree. What I find interesting, again, I mentioned this in the beginning, the interest around 2010 or so, no, a bit earlier, you get this explosion of interest in Malcolm overseas, right? Particularly in Europe, in the European urban periphery, these newly ghettoized Muslim communities, and then in Latin America, and then Middle East, North Africa. Not in the US. What you get in the US is this resurrection of James Baldwin, right? Which is fascinating, right? Why Baldwin and not Malcolm again? Or maybe actually to talk about Baldwin is to talk about Malcolm. I mean, he has that wonderful essay, Letter from a Region on My Mind, in his conversation with Elijah Muhammad, and he debates Malcolm on the radio. But I find it really interesting that overseas you get a Malcolm revival, and domestically you get a Baldwin revival. And I'm wondering if a few years from now in Europe you'll get a Baldwin revival, and the State Department will try to contain that somehow again with embassy programs and so forth. I don't have an answer. I'm just pointing this.
No, I think such a brilliant point. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to ask two more questions. They're actually geared specifically towards specific panelists, so I think that'll help sort of move us along quickly. The first one is geared towards Professor Hisham, if you want to take a stab at this one. Actually, I'm going to actually open this up to the panelists, because I think, you know, if anybody wants to jump in, but what do you feel are some of the most important artists that support and try to spread Malcolm's philosophies? Why do you think there is, oh, I'm sorry, that's the second question. So this question is about specific artists that you would recommend, or talking about this intersection between perhaps art and Malcolm, hip hop and Malcolm.
Marc, you're from Philadelphia. If you're from Philly, you want to go first?
Oh, you're muted, Marc.
Yeah, I was sitting there thinking, I can't wait to hear what Hisham say. You know, I don't, and maybe it's just out of my wheelhouse, because I don't want to become that old person that's like, oh, none of these people do what Malcolm was doing, you know. But at least in the States, I'm not seeing the kind. There are artists who take on certain pieces of it. You know what I mean? Particularly when you think about global Islam. You know, I think of artists like Mos Def. I think about even Lupe here in the States. You know, some critiques to be made for sure. But I'm inspired by that work. Mumaina Yusuf Mumu Fresh, she's a dope sister who, you know, and so I see that when I think about the radical witness, the kind of radical critiques of empire. You know, obviously in the 90s we had a decent number of folk. Nowadays, I'm not nearly as inspired. That's not to say that there aren't artists doing it. I don't believe that critiques of empire stop with my generation. Only that I probably don't pay enough attention to it. But I'd love to, you know, and again, if you know, from Philly we got Black Thought, I mean, there's so much interesting stuff happening that I'm excited by. I don't know if I see it in the tradition of Malcolm in the way that I understand Malcolm, but I'd love to hear more, and I'd love to hear about visual artists, and I'd love to hear about what's happening globally, you know, in terms of these critiques. You know, yeah, I'd love to hear from y'all. Y'all know way more about this than I do.
All right, I'm gonna date and age myself. I would say,
and No Name. I'm sorry, and No Name. No Name is doing it.
No Name, yeah. I mean, I would say start with the archive, right? Start with the people. You know, one of I can't wait for Richard Brent Turner's book. It's about to drop. It's up on Sound Islam and Jazz. He teaches, I think, in Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, but he's written before on Islam and Jazz. One of the arguments that's made is that, we often have students from Europe come to Columbia to sit in on the classes. They're absolutely not interested in the lectures, but then when we walk out, they want to see the Apollo Theater and they want to see where Malcolm hung out. One of the places I'll take students is to the IHOP on 135th Street. That used to be Small's Paradise, a jazz club where Malcolm played drums and danced. And the argument is made that because of his immersion in the jazz scene of the 1940s, it shaped his speaking style. His cadences were shaped by the big band of the 40s and the 50s. And then after his death, his speaking style would inspire Coltrane's music, right? Amiri Baraka mentions this, right? The break from bebop to hard bop. So look at that music. I mean, start with the elders, start with the ancestors, and then move up to Philadelphia in the 1970s. Billy Paul was one of the first to sample. I mean, kind of soft, but his album Turning East is worth listening to. The 1980s. Again, Europe is interesting because Keith LeBlanc, European-American percussionist, he released his, I forget the track, 1983, that samples Malcolm's speeches that hits the charts in the UK, right? And then, of course, the 90s. Listen to the 90s hip-hop that Marc and I grew up with, Guru and Public Enemy and Ice Cube and PRT. And I would recommend people overseas, in London, Low Key, for example, right? I would recommend in France, Medine, in New York, Washington Heights, Immortal Technique, Afro-Peruvian.
Great.
Very good.
Yeah.
In terms of visual arts, I'd say Muhammad Ali out of Birmingham in England. He has a website called Aerosol Arabic, and he's done some wonderful stuff on Malcolm as well. I can't think of anything else now.
I mean, that was a lot that I'm going to have to.
Oh yeah, Brother Ali.
I'm over here taking notes.
Brother Ali, my goodness.
Yeah, I actually saw Immortal Technique and Brother Ali both.
Brother Ali, my goodness.
A couple years ago, they were
soundtrack. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. They're great. Najha, was there anything else you wanted to add?
I'm trying to think, honestly, like, to be really, really honest, I don't know how many people truly embody. Maybe it's just, I don't know. But one thing I do think of, and this might not be fully answering the question, I think about Robin D.G. Kelley and Freedom Dreams and the Black radical tradition. And Robin D.G. Kelley, just amazing. And, one could argue, and not argue, but I believe that also intellectuals, academics are artists in their own right. And particularly, I'm just so moved and inspired by this whole Afro-Surrealist movement that kind of at once wrestles with the possibility of freedom that Blackness necessitates, but also just the reality of living in a white supremacist world where death is constant, Black death is constant, and kind of this struggling between those two spaces. And I think of all of the beautiful artists like Aja Monet and just so many others who come out of, I believe, or have been inspired by Afro-Surrealism, and people like Robin D.G. Kelley, who've articulated to a T what that tradition is. And it's connected to the Negritude movement. It's connected to international movements, to Paris, Europe, beyond. And so I think it's interesting to think about artists and people coming up who are really inspired by this internationalist lens of Black possibility. And I'm still, No Name is another person, but I think it's hard to really be truthful to that work when we live in a world that is so controlled by media, by capitalism, and it's easy to lose track of what does it mean to put into praxis these ideals and ideas. So I don't fully know, probably more folks will come to name, but I would definitely encourage people to read Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelley. Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, particularly the last chapter is just like, it's amazing.
Great suggestions. Great, book suggestions, music suggestions. One thing that I wanted to offer, if I can, I know I'm not a panelist, but I'm really enjoying this conversation. You know, like hip hop by definition, I believe is a radical storytelling tradition. And so, you know, I encourage folks who are listening to understand the material conditions in which many artists made art and how some of that art was responding to those material conditions and continues to happen today. I agree with Najha. I think consumerism, capitalism really has quite a hold on a lot of the art that is curated for us to consume, but that doesn't mean that art is not being generated. I also encourage folks to break out of, as Professor Hisham said, like outside of even just the US. I know, you know, I'm Indian. In India, there's a budding hip hop scene happening in the slums of, from the slums of Mumbai to Hyderabad to, you know, Karachi, Pakistan to Gaza. There's so much happening in terms of music, and that's not going to be, you know, about turning on the radio and just trying to find it that way, but, you know, really try to break out of that and seek, you know, like I said, the places in which, you know, oppressed folks are living and the material conditions they are living in, and the art that is being generated in response to those conditions, I think is important. And that's not, you know, of course, limited to the US, but is truly, truly global. And then there's one more question I would like to ask, and this is geared towards Najha. You spoke a little bit about the institutional exclusion of Malcolm, even within Black studies in the academy. And so this question is why do you think that is? Why do you think there is a deliberate institutional exclusion of Malcolm, even internal to Black studies within the academy? And I guess we can open that up a little bit, but, you know, they said specifically it's for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to open that question up as well after I share. And I'm you know, I say that in a limited kind of framework. And I know that, you know, it's complicated because I don't want to paint institutions as singular or programs as singular, but I was surprised, honestly, being at Harvard for a couple of years and not really seeing a robust program around Malcolm X. That doesn't mean that there aren't brilliant people, scholars, professors, students, organizers doing this work, but I think it's more so beyond the individual and beyond an individual Black studies program. What does it mean to do research within the institution? What does it mean to be in a white supremacist institution that has its own agenda beyond the professors that I think continue often to push, like Marc and Hisham, push the universities that they're a part of forward. And there's a lot of fear. I mean, you know, I saw some people sharing that I went to school with, shout out to Mufaz and others who, you know, for example, Professor Cornel West didn't receive tenure. And it's inconceivable to even attempt to quantify or calculate how much that singular person offered tens of thousands of people and thousands of students, including myself. You know, I'm not alone when I say I found a home in Professor West. He was one of the most generous professors, and constantly had his foot on Harvard's neck, or has his foot on Harvard's neck, and they're afraid of that. And so, you know, what does it mean to do work that expands beyond the institution, that expands beyond the Ivy League project or, you know, academia? And so I'm excited. I think more than anything, I think that's part of the context in which Black studies programs become very limited or sort of glorify and, you know, confine themselves to something like maybe the civil rights movement. But then we can look to spaces like the Shabazz Center or to Uncle Bobby's or to Freedom Schools as places that we can continue these intellectual projects beyond institutions that are exclusionary and limit us to some degree. And so that's what I'm excited. What does it mean to create our own program, our own understanding of Malcolm that, you know, isn't necessarily, you know, rooted in pushing out a paper that only a couple folks are going to read, but it's really focused on, so what does it mean to change the material conditions of the community that we live in? And how do we explore those questions? Because these are the needs that we're facing right now. And this is why we're doing this work. And I know for so many folks, including myself, the reason I wanted to study Black studies is because I saw what was happening in Ferguson. I saw what was happening in Harlem and Charlotte, North Carolina. I was at a protest where a protester was killed by the Charlotte police. And so for me, it was like, how do I understand myself? How do I understand my responsibility in this world? And that's why I wanted to continue at divinity school. And I think that's why so many folks are in academia, because we have the space to explore these questions, but we really have to be more comfortable with leaving the sort of comfort or whatever it is that we know within that academia offers and places like Columbia, et cetera, offer, and decide that we're gonna take this work and share and learn and build outside of these institutions, and really bolster up places like the Shabazz Center and others who are doing this work, and also calling on community elders and historians that haven't always had access to tenure, haven't had access to institutions and the resources to push out the knowledge that they hold, and that's so central to this project.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Najha. Professor Hill, Professor Hisham, is there anything you want to add?
I'll just say why Malcolm makes the powers that be uncomfortable. When you look at the minority communities, the urban minority communities who gravitate towards Malcolm's message and so on, they tend to be in sort of in a liminal position. They don't have full rights. They live in marginalized areas, heavily policed. And one of the messages of Malcolm is, you can rise above all that. There's the rest of the world. And I remember someone saying, what we're trying to do is talking about the context in Europe, a state official saying, we're trying with our immigrant population and the children, we're trying to transnationalize them, de-transnationalize. What Malcolm does, he does the opposite, right? He tells people, you can rise above this situation, the rest of the world is yours. And so the fear is that too much interest in Malcolm will sever the link between these populations and the nation state, right? And if you look at the debates between Malcolm and Bayard Rustin, I mean, they debated lots of things, Israel-Palestine integration versus radical international. One of the things is, you don't go overseas and criticize your country, Rustin would say. You criticize your country within its borders. And Malcolm said, no, if you look at, I spent so much time in the archives and Cairo and Paris and so on, trying to find newspapers that covered Malcolm's trips, and I couldn't find stuff. But then I came here, and then when the Schomburg got the papers, he meticulously collected everything that was published about him. Ghanaian newspapers, Saudi newspapers, and so on, and he's often in debate with Rustin on one hand or Ralph Bunche on the other, right? And the debate is about, how do you speak about your country when you step outside of its borders, right? And I think that's what makes people uncomfortable, having somebody at the international level speaking the truth so powerfully.
I love that we're contesting the nation state in this conversation. It's very relevant, and I think is a brilliant answer to this question. One that I will say I was not expecting. Marc, I think you were going to say something, but I'm not sure.
No. I appreciate what has been said. I would just add my last word on it in terms of the context of the academy is just, I think we have to be honest about where we are in terms of politics of Black studies, right? It's not that Black studies is a radical space that often that somehow excludes Malcolm. It's that the exclusion of Malcolm is symptomatic of a deeper problem, right? Which is that we too often have reduced Black studies to something other than what it could be, which is a radical field changing, epistemology shifting, world-making, intellectual praxis. And until we do that, then Malcolm will always seem appropriately excluded from the canon and from the classroom and etc. But I'm actually optimistic. Over the last few years, I've seen so much, both in university and in K-12, expansion of possibility, so much challenge to the canon, so much of a commitment to expanding Black studies and to having the very things that Malcolm's been calling us to do, right? Which is the critique of capitalism, an international, transnational analysis, a commitment to praxis, again, wedding those two things of ilm and Amin, right? Of knowledge or science and work or action, and of constant growth and development and self-critique. For me, that's Malcolm, but that's also what Black studies at its best is. And so while Malcolm is outside the reach of it, particularly as universities become more corporatized and universities look more and more like multinational corporations and institutions of higher learning, even against that backdrop, I'm watching something different happen in Black studies departments around the world. And so, as with all things Malcolm, I'm left feeling hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you for leaving us with that thought. With that, I'm going to start to wrap up. But is there anything else? I want to allow the panelists, if there's anything you'd like to offer or even plug.
I always have a plug. Not always, but today I do. Mitchell Plitnick and I wrote a book that we're very proud of. It's called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. I would encourage everyone who is inclined to buy it to do so. We think we make an interesting intervention, an important piece of the conversation about where we are. And Malcolm's legacy, is the kind of legacy that energizes me to think about this issue and to engage it in the way that I have. So yeah, that would be all. Just encourage people to support that.
And to get it from Uncle Bobby's bookstore.
That's always the best place, Get it wherever books are sold, but why not do it from an independent Black bookstore?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And for the other panelists.
Something to self-promote?
If you would like to.
If you look at the diaries of Malcolm X, one of the countries that appears often and referenced very positively and affectionately is Sudan. And we did a short doc on Malcolm X called Malcolm X and the Sudanese, on his friendship with Ahmed Osman, the economist, and Malik Bibri, who died last week. So check it out. Produced, directed by Sophie Schrago. It's online somewhere on Vimeo, but it'll take you back to all these things we're talking about. Nation of Islam, how he visited first as an emissary of the nation, and then went back later. But
wow.
Sudan and Malcolm X.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Najha, maybe even the Shabazz Center, how folks can become connected with the Shabazz Center or.
Yeah, please get in touch with us. We're at, this is a conversation with the Shabazz Center. We're in the process of really expanding our reach, our work, our ideological vision, our desire to be in deep community with other organizations, individuals, spaces who are committed to a radical politic of liberation and committed to our education, our culture production as a people. And so we're doing a lot. We're on social media. And I would say, if anything, this is not a plug, but this conversation and, getting to be a part of the Shabazz Center, it fortifies me, because it's a reminder that even though we're living in a moment that's marked by so much death, so much uncertainty, this is a really exciting moment. And we are seeing new worlds being created every second, every day. And excavating Malcolm's work and employing it in real time is a testament to this work, and that it's working, and that we need to be doing this sort of these sorts of projects. And the Shabazz Center is a testament to that. All of this is a testament to that. But I would say, if we're able to hold on to the fact that, something good is coming, I think that at least it fortifies me. And so I'm grateful to always be able to center that and feel strength in that fact, in that truth. I think that, with Trump also, it represents kind of the the fragility of whiteness and power and capitalism. And so, of course, we're looking to Malcolm now. Of course, we see his name increasing in Google searches. Of course, we're seeing young folks yearning to read about him and to really engage him in a deepened critical lens. And so I think it's good, and we have to stay connected to this work. We have to continue producing work because our ancestors existed for us to continue these projects. And so we're all doing that. And I'm really grateful to have been in conversation and to also have learned so much. So thank you all so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Najha. Thank you so much to the panelists. I do want to thank the Shabazz Center immensely for providing this opportunity. Want to thank the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies. If you're a Columbia student, please check us out. If you are student, faculty, connected to the university and would love to, are interested in Islam, Muslims, come check us out. This event in particular, as I've mentioned before, is funded in part by the Racial Justice Mini Grant Program through the Office of University Life and supported by the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life and the Office of the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement. Sorry, I'm reading that. And yeah, I wish all of our panelists and our attendees the best of health, safety, and happiness and joy as we continue navigating this world. As Najha mentioned, I'm praying for that for everyone in this virtual space. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care. Good night, everyone.